The world is a curious place. We live our lives day to day, days and weeks turning into years. Sometimes it just feels like we're going through the motions in an endless loop, unaware that there are other people, other things, living their lives as well. Sometimes our lives intersect and we have wonderful and sometimes tragic interactions, but usually in our tedious loop, we aren't really aware that there is much more going on. Certain jobs require more of us, though. Sometimes we have to do things that unexpectedly change us. One such job is the night shift. I used to think that evil was an abstract concept, something philosophers debated in wood-paneled university halls while students dozed off in their seats, dreaming of simpler things like midterms and midnight pizza runs. That was before I started working the graveyard shift at Murphy's Gas and Go, before I learned that evil has a face, or sometimes no face at all. The decision to take the job wasn't particularly dramatic, just another college student trying to balance tuition payments with the necessity of sleep, choosing the night shift because it paid an extra $1.50 per hour and left my days free for classes. Professor Harrison had warned me against it in his usual roundabout way, peering at me over wire-rimmed glasses after Philosophy 303. "The night shift changes a person, Dr. Chen," he'd say, absently turning his coffee cup so the handle aligned perfectly with the edge of his desk. "They alter one's perception of reality. The Greeks believed that in the hours between midnight and dawn, the barrier between our world and theirs grew permeable." He smiled then, but it hadn't reached his eyes. I wonder now if he knew something, if he'd seen things himself during his younger years. I wonder if that's why his hands shook whenever he lectured about Plato's cave. The fluorescent lights always buzzed louder after midnight. I'd noticed this my first week, but it wasn't until my third month that I realized the pitch changed when the customers walked in. A subtle shift, like a mosquito adjusting its flight. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it, just like I couldn't unsee other things once they started showing themselves. Murphy's sat at the intersection of Highway 23 and Old Mill Road, a beacon of harsh light and miles of darkness. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, something about being found in the walk-in cooler, his face frozen in an expression that made the responding officers quit the force. Murphy never talked about it, and I never asked. Some questions are safer left unasked. My coworkers on the shifts complained about the usual things: low pay, rude customers, the temperamental coffee machine that sometimes dispensed liquid too dark to be just coffee. But the night shift was different. We didn't last long, us graveyard workers. Most quit within weeks, mumbling about insomnia or stress or the way the security mirrors sometimes showed things that couldn't possibly be there. Sarah had been there the longest before me, 3 months and counting. She had a theory about the place, shared with me during one of our shift changeovers as the sun bled red across the horizon. "It's like those deep-sea vents," she said, organizing the cigarette display with shaking hands. "You know, where all sorts of impossible things live. I think places can be like that too. Places where reality is thinner." She laughed then, the sound sharp and brittle. "Just don't stare too long at the mirrors after midnight, and if you hear the light singing, don't sing back." I dismissed her warnings as sleep deprivation rambling. 2 days later, she didn't show up for her shift. Nobody heard from her again. The police found her car in the parking lot, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. The security cameras for that night showed only static, and the incident report mentioned something about strange burn marks on the asphalt, like someone had tried to start a fire in the shape of footprints. It was mid-October when everything changed, the kind of autumn night where the wind carries winter's promises, and fallen leaves scrape across the empty parking lots like skeletal fingers. The air felt wrong that night. heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm, but the sky was clear enough to see stars wheeling overhead in patterns that seemed subtly different from how I remembered them. I was restocking the candy aisle, trying to ignore how the security mirrors in the corners seemed to reflect shapes that weren't there. The motion always caught my peripheral vision. A customer browsing the chips, a tall figure standing by the coffee station. But when I turned to look directly, the store was empty. I'd grown used to this, like I'd grown used to the way certain items would rearrange themselves between my rounds, or how the walk-in cooler sometimes hummed in frequencies that made my teeth filings ache. The radio behind the counter played static-filled snippets of late-night talk shows, the hosts' voices occasionally distorting into something that almost sounded like words in a language I'd never heard, but somehow understood. I was reaching for a box of chocolate bars when the music shifted to a high-pitched whine, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath clouded in front of my face. The door chime rang. Not the usual electronic beep, but a drawn-out tone that made my teeth ache. I turned, a retail smile already plastered on my face, but there was no one there. Just the glass door slowly swinging shut against the night air. The security camera above the entrance showed only darkness, though I could have sworn the darkness moved in a way that darkness shouldn't. The fluorescent lights buzzed higher, almost a whine now, and in that moment I remembered Sarah's words. If you hear the lights singing, don't sing back. But what if they weren't singing? What if they are screaming? I walked to the door, telling myself it was just the wind, just another late-night false alarm like the cats that sometimes triggered the motion sensors. Though I'd started to notice how those cats never seemed to leave footprints, and how their shadows sometimes lingered long after they'd slunk away into the darkness. The security mirrors showed my reflection approaching the door, but something about my movements seemed delayed, as if my reflection was reluctant to follow. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the pool of light from our parking lot fixtures. It was tall, a little too tall, and though it wore what looked like a business suit, there was something wrong with its proportions. Its arms hung too low, fingers nearly brushing the ground, and the fabric of its suit seemed to ripple in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. The longer I looked, the more details seemed wrong. The angle of its shoulders, the way its clothes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The subtle wrongness of its stance, like a mannequin posed by someone who'd only ever seen humans in photographs. But most oddly, it had no face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin like wax left too long in the sun. But somehow I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its attention like ice water down my spine, like static electricity raising the hair on my arms. The air between us felt charged, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure took a step forward, its movement too fluid, like watching film played at the wrong speed. Another step, its fingers, too many fingers, twitched at its side, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't twitching at all, but beckoning. The lights buzzed louder, their pitch rising until it matched the ringing in my ears. Behind me, the coffee machine gurgled to life unprompted and unexpectedly dispensing a liquid too thick and too dark to be coffee. The security mirrors showed the figure standing directly behind me, though I could still see it outside, still advancing with that terrible liquid grace. I ran to the back office, slammed the door, and called the police. My hands shook so badly I had to dial twice. The dispatcher's voice sounded distant, distorted, as if coming through layers of water. I tried to explain what I was seeing, but the words felt wrong in my mouth, like trying to describe colors to someone who'd never seen them. When the police finally arrived, they found nothing, of course, just some footprints in the mud that the officer said were probably deer tracks, though deer don't usually wear Oxford shoes or leave impressions that smoke faintly in the morning air. The officer wrote it off as another case of night shift paranoia, but I saw how his hand kept straying to his gun. how he wouldn't look directly at the security cameras. As he left, he hesitated at the door. "Word of advice, kid," he said, his voice low. "If you keep working these hours, invest in protection and not the kind they sell behind the counters." He glanced at the darkness beyond the parking lot lights, then back at me. "Some nights, the thin places get thinner, and what comes through..." He shook his head and left, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist like knives. I bought a gun the next day. Nothing fancy, just a simple revolver that fit in my jacket pocket. The shop owner asked no questions, just nodded grimly when I mentioned the night shift. The weight of it was reassuring, even though my hands shook every time I touched it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that one strange encounter didn't justify armed self-defense. But then I started noticing things. Little things. Like how some customers cast shadows that moved a half a second too late. How others had reflections in the security mirrors that didn't quite match their movements. How the buzz of the fluorescent lights sometimes formed patterns that almost sounded like words in that same strange language I'd heard on the radio. How certain regulars never seemed to blink or breathe, or leave footprints on rainy nights. I started to keep a journal documenting the strange occurrences that filled my shifts. The entries became increasingly erratic, my handwriting deteriorating as I tried describing things that shouldn't exist in any rational world. I drew diagrams of the impossible angles I'd glimpse in the mirrors, wrote down the words I thought I heard in the static, tracked the patterns of when the lights sang loudest. Professor Harrison found me sleeping in the library one afternoon, my journal open to a page filled with sketches of faceless figures. He asked to see the journal, and when I reluctantly agreed, he studied the drawings for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. "The Greeks," he said, "have a word for the spaces between spaces, the moments between moments. They call them liminal zones, places where reality wears thin. They believed that certain locations, under certain circumstances..." He trailed off, staring at something I couldn't see. "Be careful, Mr. Chen. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown." But it was too late for warnings. I'd already seen too much, and what I'd seen was about to see me back. It came back a week later. This time, it wasn't alone. I was checking the expiration dates on the milk when the door chime rang with that same wrong tone. The security cameras flickered and died, their screens filled with a static that seemed to move with purpose. The fluorescent lights dimmed, their buzz dropping to a low, anticipatory hum. The figures stood there, identical to before, but now flanked by two others. They wore different suits, one charcoal gray, one pinstripe, but their faces were the same smooth blankness, their proportions just as wrong. The original figure's suit still rippled in impossible ways, but now I could see what caused the movement, something shifting beneath the fabric, like snakes under silk. The lights screamed. My hand was on the gun before I realized I'd moved. The figures took synchronized steps forward, their movements liquid and horrible. I backed away, bumping into the dairy case. The cold through my shirt anchored me to reality, reminded me that this was happening, that I wasn't dreaming. The gun felt impossibly heavy in my hand. "We've been watching you," said a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but rather the absence of silence. It came from all three figures at once, their blank faces rippling like disturbed water. "You see too much." The first figure reached out with those two long fingers. In the fluorescent light, I could see that its skin was transparent in places, showing something dark moving underneath. That's when I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the confined space, like a thunderclap in a cathedral. The figure staggered, but instead of blood, black smoke poured from the wound. It made a noise, not quite a scream, more like radio static played backwards, and it lunged forward toward me. I fired again and again. Each impact released more of that strange smoke until the air was thick with it. The smoke had a smell I recognized from my childhood, like the moment before a lightning strike, like ozone and burning metal and something older than time. The other figures stood motionless, watching as their companion collapsed. Its suit crumpled inward as if suddenly empty, and smoke swirled around it before dissipating into nothing. The remaining figures retreated, their movements jerky now, almost fearful. They backed out into the night and vanished, leaving only footprints that smoldered in the asphalt. The lights returned to normal, though their buzz now carried an undertone of what might have been satisfaction. I cleaned up what little evidence remained, some scorch marks on the floor, shell casings that felt cold even hours later. The security cameras had stopped working at midnight. Their displays showed only static, though sometimes I caught glimpses of faces in the snow. So many faces, all with eyes that looked back at me with something like hunger. I filed no police report. Who would believe me? Instead, I wrote everything in my journal, my pen tearing the paper as I tried to capture details that seemed to slip away like water the moment I tried to focus on them. The entry ended with a question that would haunt me. If these things exist, how many more are out there? The answer came sooner than I expected, and it was worse than what I could have imagined. Something changed in me that night. It was as if the encounter had adjusted my vision, like tuning a radio to pick up frequencies that had always been there, but just out of range. I began to see them everywhere, the almost people with their wrong proportions and empty faces. They walked among us, wearing human shapes like ill-fitting suits, their true nature visible only in glimpses, a too-wide smile, fingers that bent backward, eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Most were like the ones I'd encountered, black-faced figures in business attire, but others were more sophisticated, better at mimicking humanity. These were the dangerous ones. They held positions of power, influenced decisions, spread corruption like a virus, and nobody noticed except me. I started carrying silver bullets after research in the university's restricted archives suggested they might be more effective. The librarian who helped me find the texts, an elderly woman with cat's eye glasses and trembling hands, seemed unsurprised by my questions. As I was leaving, she pressed a small book bound in what looked like human flesh into my hands. "The world is fuller than most people think," she whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. "And what fills it isn't always kind." She disappeared into the stacks before I could thank her, and when I returned the next day, no one seemed to remember a librarian matching her description. The book became my Bible. Its pages were filled with accounts spanning centuries, night watchmen, lonely travelers, and others who had glimpsed what lurked in the spaces between reality. Some of the entries were in languages I'd never seen before, but I could read them anyway, the words burning themselves into my mind like brands on a cow's hide. I learned to recognize the signs, the way electronics malfunction in their presence, how plants wilt when they pass, the subtle wrongness they bring to any space they occupy. I became a hunter of sorts, though I prefer to think of it as pest control. I kept working the night shift, but now I chose my locations carefully. Murphy's wasn't the only thin place in town. There was the 24-hour laundromat on Maple Street, where the washing machines sometimes ran backward and cleaned clothes of more than just stains. The all-night diner where coffee refilled itself and customers sometimes disappeared between ordering and paying. The late-night pharmacy where the security mirrors showed things that made the overnight pharmacist wear a blindfold during inventory. My journal entries became a catalog of encounters. December 15th, 3 entities at the laundromat posing as college students. Their reflections showed something with too many limbs folding clothes that leaked dark water. December 23rd, a thing wearing a police officer's shape pulling over lone drivers on Highway 23. Its dashboard camera recorded static and screams. January 4th, a group of them infiltrating a midnight church service, their hymns in that same impossible language I'd heard in the convenience store's static. The guilt faded with each encounter. It's not murder if they were never alive to begin with. Besides, I've seen what happens to people who spend too much time near these things, how they change, become hollow-eyed and strange, until one day they too cast shadows that move wrong. Professor Harrison noticed the change in me. He caught me after class one day, his hands shaking worse than ever as he was grading papers that seemed to be written in ink that moved across the page. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. "The ones who wear our shapes like borrowed clothes?" When I nodded, he sighed and suddenly looked much older. "I was young like you once, young. Certain I could fight what lives in the darkness, but the darkness, it fights back, Mr. Chen, and it fights dirty." I found his office empty the next day, the walls covered in drawings of faceless figures and mathematical equations that made my eyes hurt. The official story was that he'd taken an early retirement, but I knew better. I'd seen something wearing his face in the grocery store at 3 a.m. Its movements too precise, its smile too wide. I still work the night shift, but now I choose the stores in areas where the veil between the worlds seems thinnest, places where the fluorescent lights buzz in frequencies that human ears shouldn't be able to hear, where the security mirrors show things that shouldn't exist. I wait and I watch, and when necessary, I act. The silver bullets help, but I've found other tools too. Salt lines at the doors, iron filings in the air vents, UV lights that reveal their true forms, though looking directly at those forms has cost more than one security guard their sanity. The book taught me symbols that burn them when drawn, though the ink has to be mixed with my own blood, and each symbol carved into my skin stays cold no matter the weather. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going mad. But then I see another blank face in the crowd, another too tall figure standing too still, and I know that madness would be more comforting than this truth, that evil isn't abstract at all. It walks among us, wears our shapes, mimics our movements, and most people never notice until it's too late. Last week, I found Sarah's journal behind the drink cooler at Murphy's. The final entry was a detailed drawing of what she'd seen in the security mirrors that last night. The page was stained with something that might have been tears, might have been blood, might have been something else entirely. But it was her last words that chilled me. "They're not invading. They've always been here. We're the invaders in their world." The fluorescent lights are buzzing louder now. The door chime is ringing with that wrong tone again. My hands move to the gun in my pocket and I smile. They may look human, but they bleed smoke, and I've gotten very good at making things bleed. Tonight feels different, though. The air has that same heavy quality it had that first night, like the atmosphere is pressing in around me. The security mirrors are showing impossible angles again, and in their warped reflections, I can see figures gathering in the parking lot, more than I've ever seen before. They're not trying to hide anymore. Their suits ripple with that strange undulation, their blank faces somehow conveying anger despite their featureless surfaces. I count them. 12 of them. No, 15. Their forms shift and blur together in ways that make counting difficult. The book sits heavy in my other pocket, its pages warm against my legs. I've learned more since those first encounters. Each entity I've dispatched has taught me something new, the way they move, the patterns they follow, the symbols that hurt them the most. But most importantly, I've learned why they're here. The elderly librarian, or whatever wore her shape, was right. The world is fuller than most people think, but what she didn't tell me was that it's getting fuller. The spaces between spaces are growing, the thin places spreading like cracks in old glass, and through those cracks, things that were once contained are slipping through. The door opens, the figures enter in perfect synchronization, their movements a mockery of human locomotion, the lights flicker, and in those microseconds of darkness, I catch glimpses of their true forms. The sight should drive me mad, but I've seen worse things in the security mirrors at 3 a.m. "You can't stop what's coming," they said in a voice that isn't a voice. "The barriers are falling. What was separate will be one again." I draw the gun, its silver bullets inscribed with symbols from the book. "Maybe," I say, feeling the weight of Sarah's journal in my pocket, the truth of her words, "but I can sure as hell slow it down." The lights scream, the figures lunge, and I fire. After all, someone has to protect the late-night shoppers, the lonely gas station attendants, the vulnerable souls who find themselves alone in the small hours. Someone has to stand guard against the things that wear human skin like borrowed clothes. Someone has to watch the thin places, to fight whatever comes through them. The night shift never really ends, it just keeps going. One bullet at a time, one entity at a time, holding back the darkness that threatens to seep through the cracks in our world. And if sometimes, in the security mirrors, my reflection moves a half a second too late, or my shadow stretches a bit too long, well, that's just an occupational hazard. Welcome to the night shift. The fluorescents are singing and the darkness is hungry, but so am I. Thanks for listening to my Dark Veil tale. Make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. It really does help me grow this channel so I can make more content for your enjoyment. Also, check out the linked video for another creeper-style story from Dark Veil Tales.